Well, just to kind of build on a theme, we all talked about work and making it personal. These are my grandparents. First of all, before I start, does everyone here know what an Armenian is? And Armenians in the crowd, do not raise your hands. All right, silence. All right.
One person.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Armenians are an ancient Near Eastern people. According to the New York Times, we became an ethnically distinct people in 3500 BC. And we are famous for a number of different things, from being the first Christian nation to Kim Kardashian, to more relevantly, we are known for being the
People who break microphones.
for being the victims of one of the first genocides of the 20th century. Unfortunately, that's kind of all anyone knows about us. And so when I was growing up in Massachusetts, I was fascinated by my fellow Armenians. I wanted to know everything I could about us. I would spend weekends with my grandparents, who you can see here, and go through their magazines, and one of them had a map of places that had Armenian organizations, and it was every place from Argentina to Ethiopia to Aleppo, and I was fascinated. I wondered, what is life like for an Armenian kid in Sao Paulo, Brazil? Is it anything like mine? What do I have in common with an Armenian kid in Argentina? What do I have in common with Armenian kids in Moscow? I was deeply curious about this. Or an Armenian kid in Armenia. Is there something that we have in common, or have the different paths out of Armenia taken by our refugee grandparents changed us irrevocably? And so I decided to go find out. And so, kind of completely driven by curiosity, as kind of you've learned all of these projects are, I decided to go find out for myself. And so I went to the one remaining Armenian village in Turkey called Vakifla on the Syrian border. And I met this totally deranged small child who was interested in destroying this motorcycle. I sat with card-playing revolutionaries in Lebanon. I swam with resettled Syrian Armenian refugees in an unrecognized Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh. I mourned the victims of the genocide in Los Angeles, and I celebrated an Armenian holiday of Vartavar in Istanbul with the Armenians that continue to live there. I danced in Armenia. I cheered on rugby players in India. I had an extremely drunken barbecue with some monks in Venice. We then watched Eurovision together. If any of you saw Eurovision this year, explaining the winner of Eurovision to a bunch of monks, it was a drag performer won. She wore a beautiful, tight evening gown. She had a beard. They were like, I don't understand. Is this a man with a beard? Is this a man in a dress, a woman with a beard? What's going on? I sparred with boxers in Moscow that I kind of stumbled upon while walking down the street. But kind of midway through the project, it became about more than just my curiosity. I started to realize that beyond this, I'm going to say just being, but beyond this being 100 years after this people were sent into exile, beyond this being 100 years after the genocide, it's a particularly fragile moment in our history. The family that I lived with in Kasab have been driven from their homes by the brutality of the Syrian civil war. The families that I photographed in Damascus and Aleppo are now living in Armenia or in Beirut. Ethiopia used to have one of the oldest, strongest Armenian communities in the world, and now it's down to just a few families. The Egyptian Armenian community is leaving Egypt in droves and moving to Los Angeles because of the post-revolutionary upheaval. Armenia itself, many villages are emptied of men during the working year, which is pretty much any time except for January and February, as they move to Moscow to become migrant workers. And even in the kind of more successful communities like the United States or Brazil or Argentina, people are worried that their physical survival is at the cost of their culture as people are assimilating. And so I started to realize that this was a really important project. It wasn't just me being curious. And I started to think about, what does it even mean these days, 100 years after we have been forced to leave Armenia? What does it even mean to be Armenian? Does it mean you have to keep all of the customs of the old country, like this village in Lebanon called Anjar, where if my great-grandparents showed up today and went to a wedding, they would feel 100% at home. And or do these kids in Los Angeles, at a genocide march, do these kids also count? Are these kids also part of the larger Armenian story? And that became part of it as well, kind of expanding the box of what it means to be an Armenian. When I was a kid, people like me who are half Armenian did not necessarily fit in the box. The box was you have two Armenian parents, you go to the Armenian organizations, you go to Armenian church, you go to Armenian school, you marry an Armenian of the opposite gender, and then you are successful in a very specific way. And that, of course, leaves out a lot of people. And so I became fascinated by the kind of diversity of the Armenian community. Do you have to belong to the organizations to be Armenian? Is it the church that holds people together? Is it the traditions, the kind of the ways of the old country? Or is it something kind of more ephemeral? Is it something more undescribable? Is it our shared history? Is it this shared kind of paths taken by our ancestors? These are postcards that my family members in Syria sent to my family members in the United States after they were separated by the genocide. Is it the things that people care about today, like Nagorno-Karabakh? A lot of Armenians, basically it's an unrecognized republic, but it's very important to the Armenian people. It is de facto Armenian, de jure part of Azerbaijan, and it's very important to people. So are these the things that hold a people together? Or is it, what exactly does this French kid in front of a cathedral in Paris have to do with these children who have just finished school in Nagorno-Karabakh? What is the thread that holds them together? Or these kids in Anjar, Lebanon? Is there something that holds them together? Is it the shared family history? Is it our stories of the old country? Is it the way that we remember our past? Do we have a shared memory of our past? Is it the food? I mean, because let's be honest, for a lot of us, it's the food. It's how we reflect our heritage these days. And what I found is that yes, there is a thread that ties this girl in India who's experiencing monsoon season for the first time in Kolkata with these students in Cyprus who are at a summer camp. With these kids at the one remaining Armenian refugee genocide era refugee camp in Lebanon. There is something that ties this young monk who is from Armenia and is part of a monastery in Venice with this young man who's half African Ethiopian and half Armenian Ethiopian and is the altar boy at the St. George Armenian Church in Addis Ababa. There is a thread that ties them together with this mother in a suburb of Paris, with this mother in Armenia. These kids in DC, the Scouts in DC, with these kind of snotty-looking Armenian girls in Armenia. This gay couple in New York with this straight couple in Moscow. This family in Karabakh with this new mother in Karabakh and this new mother she's from Philadelphia. She flew to Aleppo to have her child in an Armenian-speaking hospital with her grandparents. And so there's something there. I talked to a woman in Argentina who talked about it being kind of a membership of a secret club that only members knew existed. I could show up throughout this whole project. I usually would have one or two connections with people when I would go to a different country. I went to 22 countries for this project.
Only 22?
Only 22, I know. Believe me, there are a lot of people who are like, why didn't you go to Finland? And I did not go to Finland, although I hear it's beautiful. And I could show up at an Armenian club at the Agump and say, hi, my name is, Scout Tufankjian, and speak a little Armenian, and I would be welcomed in as a cousin. It wasn't as a, it was family. It was an immediate kind of web of family, and so that has a lot to do with it. I interviewed someone who's from France, and he said, when I meet another Armenian, there's an instant connection there that I just don't feel with any other people. It's the shared history. He wasn't sure what it is, and for me, I asked a lot of different people what they thought about being Armenian, what they liked about it, what they don't like, because one of the things about this project was looking at people kind of wrestling with their identity and wrestling with these issues of assimilation. And so I asked a lot of people what they did and didn't like. And usually what people don't like is, their cousins being all up in their business. And Danielle Chalakian of New York said, when I asked her what she liked about being Armenian, she said, I don't really know how to answer this question. I like who it makes me. I like that I'm a fighter and I'm righteous and I'm passionate and I feel like I have a century of survival in me. And the biggest part of this project for me was to reframe the Armenian story from a story of victimhood. We're all, anyone who has heard of Armenians who is not Armenian, other than Kim Kardashian, hears about it through this kind of story of genocide. We are victims, we are a disappeared people, we are, oh, it's so sad what happened to the Armenians, the starving Armenians, they're not there anymore. And part of this, the biggest part of this project for me was to show that no, the Armenian story did not begin in 1915 with the genocide, it did not end in 1915 with the genocide. We ourselves do not see ourselves through the lens of the genocide. Why should anyone else? And so that's kind of what this project has been about. Yeah.
Wonderful. Wow. So 22 countries. That's incredible.
Deranged. Yeah.
I didn't want to say that, but over what period of time was this?
So I keep describing this as a 4-year project, but I started it in 2009, and there's a picture from 2006, and you will note that neither of those things are 4 years ago. So I started working on it in 2009, kind of after my first book did well enough to kind of give me the time and kind of funds to be able to start working on this. But I worked on it off and on. So, I started in 2009, but I also covered the Haitian earthquake and the Egyptian revolution and the 2012 Obama campaign. And so it wasn't really 2013 I really started working on it full time.
Mm-hmm. So that's sort of, you're giving yourself quite a big responsibility, I think, to figure out what it means to be Armenian and how people connect with one another. How do you then honor that responsibility? How do you approach the photographs that you take or the stories that you choose to tell?
Yeah, part of the responsibility involves kind of trying to tell as many different stories as I can and not just the kind of stories of the people who fit into this box of a good Armenian. When people first saw the project, there was a lot of, oh, well, there's too many poor people, or why are there gay people, or that kid looks black, and their stories are as much a part of the Armenian story as, this girl who is from Armenia. So that's a large part of the responsibility. I also did about 400 interviews.
Wow.
And so there are quotes from people in the interviews that are in the book. And one of the things I found that I was really surprised by is I grew up kind of outside of the main Armenian community, which is probably why it was so fascinating for me. And also because I'm half Armenian. So when you're half anything, you spend a lot of time thinking about what it means to be of that origin. And so I always kind of wrestled with this idea, do I fit? Am I, do I count actually as part of this people? And I actually was really surprised to find that I was not the only person who, I would go to Armenian events and everyone looks so confident and they're so comfortable here, and I feel like maybe I don't know if I belong, and actually everyone feels that way. There's a lot of kind of constant arguments about what and I think this is not, again, this project is very specifically about Armenians, but it kind of could be about, anyone could do this about any kind of ethnic group. We have a specific set of circumstances, but I think a lot of people wrestle with who they are, especially in places where, assimilation is something that has happened to the Armenian people. It's not just in the United States. The few places where it hasn't happened as much, it's been because of kind of external circumstances, like the Lebanese Civil War makes it safer to stay with your own people. Therefore, the Lebanese community is not as assimilated as, say, the New York community, which is the great melting pot. And so it's a really interesting kind of time to do it.
What did you learn about your personal connection then? Like, how do you define?
Yeah, no, I know. It's hard to, because we're all journalists, right? This is by far the most personal project I've ever worked on in my entire life. I usually tell other people's stories. And this is not just my story. This is, the story of the Armenian people, which is terrifying to say. But I think I realized, there's a few things I realized. We talk about, a lot of people talk about being Armenian as a responsibility. You have a responsibility to go to these events, and I think this is probably true of a lot of ethnic groups as well. You have to go to the church bazaars, and you have to go to the social things, and you have to keep up, your responsibility and tell the history, and it's a responsibility. But it's not a burden, and I think we do ourselves a disservice by looking at it as a burden. The people that I photographed are amazing, and their stories are interesting, and their lives are interesting. And I think if we stop looking at, or stop thinking about kind of Armenianness as being this thing that's really difficult, and realize that it's also really awesome. And that's certainly what I realized, is that it doesn't quite have to be as fraught as I thought it was when I was younger.
Right. Well, so this is obviously a departure in some ways, in many ways, from the work that you've done in the past.
Yeah.
How did that, getting personal in this way, really going into your roots and your background and your family's background and so on, how's that affected your work overall or your way of approaching?
Yeah, it was really scary. Because the big projects I've worked on before this, I lived in Gaza for a long time and worked on stuff there. I covered both Obama campaigns. Covered the Arab Spring. And those stories are kind of clearly interesting. Whereas this, I was really worried, wouldn't mean anything to anyone other than kind of me and maybe my dad. Although I talked to my dad yesterday, and he's like, come on, 2 people are going to buy your book, maybe. I was like... But then I did a Kickstarter campaign. So this project was partially funded by a Kickstarter campaign. And of course, my dad thought no one would give to it. He still doesn't quite understand how that all works. But I started it in exactly a year ago, and it was amazing. The response was really incredible. And not just the money we raised, which of course was hugely important in this book, which is right here, never would have happened without it, and I never would have been able to travel to all the places I went, but I never would have had all the connections that I had. It never would have occurred to me to go to Hong Kong or Singapore, and I maybe wouldn't have gone to Australia or Uruguay or a number of different places. And what was really important about it was seeing that it struck a chord with someone who is not me or my dad, and to see that the community was really embracing it, and to see that that I wasn't the only little kid, the only person who, as a small child, had been kind of looking for this, had been looking for stories that weren't the genocide. Because obviously the genocide is the essential trauma that kind of runs through our lives, but it's not all we are. And to discover that there were kind of, everyone wanted to hear more than that, was really incredible.
So would you say then, for your next, whatever you go to work on next, that you would think about it in a more multi-layered way, that this has sort of informed that you would come at it and kind of go a little bit more in depth, or is it just...
Well, I've always been interested in ordinary people kind of not caught up in kind of major historical times, but kind of involved in. When I covered the first Obama campaign, I obviously photographed Obama, but the thing that I was most drawn to were the supporters, were the fact that it was, genuinely a grassroots movement, and so they were the people that I was really interested in. Were the kids who were dropped off in a different neighborhood after school every day to canvass for him. The people who took days off of school to kind of wait in line to, or days off from work to wait in line. Those were the people I was interested in. Were the supporters much more than him. And the Egyptian Revolution, I was really interested in these kids that were. Both the kids who were manning the barricades, the college kids who were manning the barricades, who were very worried because they had beards. They were very worried that everyone would think that they were Muslim Brotherhood, but really they just hadn't been home to shave. And the kids that were using it as an opportunity to go on dates. In the middle of the revolution, parents were really worried about their daughters going to the square, and they weren't worried about them getting hurt. They were worried that they were going to meet boys, which they were. And so that kind of stuff has always really fascinated me. The kind of people having, living their lives in the midst of these, what we think of, when you look back in the history books 100 years from now, this will be something that people study. They won't study the kids going on dates,
Right, and that's a huge part of the story.
And this is a large part of that as well. So these are the people, we're at the centennial of the Armenian genocide. There's a lot of attention focused on the diaspora, on Armenians, and a lot of people are talking about it as if it is a monolith. The diaspora wants this, the diaspora wants that. And, I spent 6 years interviewing and photographing hundreds and hundreds of Armenians, and I did not meet 2 people who thought the same thing about anything. It's an incredibly diverse group of people. They all want different things, and I think that that's important to remember.
Sure, absolutely. Do you think that focusing, I mean, I know you just said your dad was saying, oh, well, maybe only a couple of people will pay attention to this, but I wonder if you think that just focusing on one group or not, I mean, that you're in some way just automatically walling off, other people from experiencing this work, or you think
Yeah,
maybe...
I mean, that is a concern. It's definitely a concern. The thing about it is that it is specifically about Armenians, in the same way that all of our work is specifically about something, but it's also about the immigrant experience. It's also about what happens when a community is sent into exile. It could be, any community that is diaspora. The African diaspora, I'm sure, is going through similar things that the Armenian diaspora is going through. You have a situation where large numbers of people, it's different waves. Okay, I'm going to back up a little bit. Los Angeles. Anyone here who's been to Los Angeles knows that there's a huge Armenian community. My brother-in-laws both live in LA, and they talk about the Armenians. And when I think of it, they think of it as kind of one community, and I think of it as the genocide-era Armenians, the Armenians from Beirut, the Armenians from Iran, the Armenians from the Soviet Union, and then the most recent economic migrants, and that these are 5 kind of distinct waves of migrants. And the same thing could be said about any kind of major diaspora. You have, it could be true of the African diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, the Iranian diaspora. I mean, this story is kind of specifically about Armenians, but could also just be about the immigrant experience and what it's like to be from some place that doesn't necessarily exist anymore.
Yeah, I noticed there's been some reporting recently because the centennial is officially commemorated this coming Friday. Is that right? So
yeah, I'm flying to Istanbul tomorrow.
Are you?
Yeah.
So how will you cover that? How will you cover it? And
well,
what are you
it's complicated. So I'm not. I am undecided yet whether or not I'm covering it as a journalist or experiencing it as an Armenian, and I don't think I'm not sure I can do both. Certainly, I don't know. I mean, all you photographers out there, when you are photographing something, do you also feel like you are all of a sudden kind of outside of the experience, and you are, yeah. And so I don't know if I want to be outside of this experience of the genocide centennial in Istanbul, or if I want to be within it.
Did you feel in photographing this that you were outside of it?
Sometimes.
Huh. Any particular?
Sometimes I did, and sometimes I didn't. This was straight. I actually shot. So to talk about process for a second, the first shoot I did with this, I did with my traditional SLR, and it was not working at all. I have these big Nikons, and they're great, and they make beautiful pictures, but they're loud, and they cover most of my face, and it becomes a very kind of, and now is the time when I'm taking your picture. And if you're photographing people who aren't used to being photographed, it's very alienating. If you're in people's homes, I was in Sao Paulo, and people were like, "This is so great. We're so glad that you're doing this project. We're so glad you're starting in Brazil." And I would lift up my camera to take a picture, and they'd be like, "Whoa, what are you doing?" And so I switched to. I bought a Leica, and I started shooting it in film. You'll notice this. I don't know if you noticed that some of the pictures are black and white. So I started shooting it in film with Tri-X, and then kind of after a kind of year and a half of that, I realized that, well, I'm not really a black and white photographer, and that this wasn't really a black and white story. And I was worried that the kind of black and whiteness was its own cliche. That, you use black and white to photograph disappeared people, and the whole point of the project is that we are not disappeared people. And so then I got an M9, and so using the Leica made a huge difference. It's a quieter camera, it's smaller, you are more a part of the conversation when you have it. It's you're experiencing things with the people much more than you are with the giant SLR. Yeah. For me. Anyway.
That makes sense. You all of a sudden have this giant thing covering you, and
and it makes a big noise. It goes.
Yeah. And the spotlight's kind of on you.
Yeah.
So when did you decide you were going to make this into a book?
I always kind of conceived of it as a book project. Okay. And I always claimed it was going to be a book when I introduced myself to people and muscled my way into their homes. But I didn't really have any distinct plans. My first book was about the 2008 Obama campaign, and it basically sold itself.
Yeah.
And it kind of all happened without my being aware. I mean, I was aware of it, but I wrote a book proposal. A book agent found me. I wrote a book proposal. She sent it to publishers. I got a book deal, and then the book came out. But this all happened kind of in the last 3 months of the campaign, and I was on the road the whole time, and I didn't even get to look at proofs. And it was kind of like I came off the campaign, and they were like, "Wow, here's your book." So
it just happens like that for everybody.
yeah. And so when I did this, I had no idea what I was getting into, and it was obviously a more involved process.
To just kind of detour a little bit to the campaign, can you bring up are you guys familiar with Scout's work from the Obama campaign? She shot the most, what was it? The most
It was
tweet voice of an Ellen
briefly, yeah,
Taylor.
no, it's been beaten a couple times now. It was briefly, let's see, here's some Obama stuff. I think they're at the end here. Oh no, that's 2008, sorry. I do have it. 2012, there we go.
There it is. So she shot this image and it was everywhere and tweeted a bajillion times. It broke the internet.
But much
Oh
like
God,
my
Armenians
book.
breaking the internet. You
Yes,
too.
exactly. That's true, actually.
That's amazing.
Yeah, much like my book, this had nothing to do with me. I mean, it had something to do with me, and then I took the picture, much like I took the pictures with my first book. But this really, I mean, the kind of phenomenon that was this picture has more to do with the amazing kind of social media team at the Obama. So in 2007 and 2008 and 2006, I covered that campaign as a journalist. I shot it for a bunch of different news magazines. In 2012, I was the campaign photographer.
Right.
So that is why this picture became, as big as it did. It has nothing to do with me.
Well, I think it has something to do with you and your ability to catch that moment.
Yeah, I mean, I photographed him almost every day for 3 years. So it kind of gives you, it allows you to kind of have a little bit of a guess about how things are going to go.
How would you, I'm sure they're very different experiences, but you were at this point working for the campaign. So could you talk a little bit about what it's like to be a photojournalist, but then you're hired by a campaign?
I was really worried about it. And it turned out that I was the only person who was worried about it, which I found kind of upsetting. People were like, "You're just a photographer, no one cares." I was really worried about it. The people, so they hired me. I didn't apply for the job. So, which was great. It meant that they liked the way I shot the first campaign, and they just wanted me to kind of do that again. And so I didn't really change up anything. I didn't edit my own work. They didn't let me, put pictures into the world. There was a kind of large number of people who were involved in doing that. But I just shot the way I always shot, and I sent them my selects, and they did something with them. I was usually too tired to notice. But the main difference was, especially for freelancers, is that I didn't have to hustle. I didn't have to figure out how I was going to pay for the next trip, and I didn't have to figure out, how I was going to afford to stay on the campaign. The first campaign, I had covered the election that brought Hamas to power in Gaza, but that was the only election I had covered before I started covering him. And I just thought it would be really fun. I was burnt out from covering conflict, and I thought this would be great. I'll stay in America. I'll be able to hang out with my boyfriend. I'll have a life. And then none of those things happened. I did get to hang out in America. That part was great. I got to see so much more of the country than I'd ever seen before. But I did not. I saw my boyfriend, I think, 3 times. I was on the campaign. I became obsessed, much like this other project. It's these kind of mild curiosities. I thought, this would be really fun. This guy, seems like people really like him. This will be a really great way to see the country. And they become these kind of all-consuming obsessions. What did you actually ask me something? Oh, how is it different? Yeah, but it was a huge hustle. So I started covering, by the time he was kind of flying from state to state, and there was a campaign plane that costs something in the realm of $500 a half an hour to fly on. I'd been covering him for over a year, and this was my story, so I was not going to back down, but I'm a freelancer. So how am I going to pay $500 a half hour to fly with him? And you couldn't even really plan ahead, because you'd say, okay, he's going to do these 3 events in Nevada, which is one thing I learned in the campaign, is it's Nevada and not Nevada. They get mad if you say Nevada. And so it'll cost probably, the whole day will cost about $900 or something like that. And then midway through the day, he's got to go back to DC to vote, and all of a sudden there's an extra $4,000, and it was terrifying. It was a really scary thing. He had I ended the campaign with. I maxed out 5 credit cards, and I had $45,000 of credit card debt. And he had a line in his speech towards the end that said, the average American has $7,000 worth of credit card debt, and I would just kind of start twitching. Be like, oh, God. And it was, there's this great book called Boys on the Bus about campaigning, and very little has changed other than that there are more women, and there are computers, and our deadlines are every 5 minutes. But the culture of it really stays the same. And one of the things he says is that journalists covering primaries all want their candidate to win, not because they particularly like their candidate most of the time. Most of the time, they're actually more interested in the other guy because they're sick of their guy. But because if the candidate wins the primary, they get to do a book. The candidate loses the primary, they don't get to do a book. And I found myself in this very awkward journalist position where I was like, oh, God, please, I've got to do this book. Otherwise, I'm never going to get out of debt.
And then you did.
And then I did. And so that was great.
And that then allowed you to go on and do your newest project.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty.
Yeah. No, it's been great.
Thanks, Obama.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for my health care too. I like that.
And tell us a little bit more. So your book is now on sale. Is it coming out?
It's available for pre-order. It was supposed to be out April 14th, and apparently there were some shipping problems that apparently no one is responsible for. But it's coming out April 28th. But you can pre-order it on Amazon. Looks like this. Let's see, it's got this very pretty slip cover. And I think it's $39.99 retail, but I think it's $28 on Amazon right now. So if you pre-order, it's very cheap.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Let's, get the audience to ask a few questions if you guys have some things you'd like to ask. Anyone?
Nothing.
I see this one.
All right.
I was wondering, is this thing on? Is it working? I was wondering if you had any really memorable experiences of finding something Armenian in common with somebody on the other end of the universe.
Yeah,
Back to your other work just happening.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
So I mentioned where is it? Where did I put it? Here we go. I'm just going to have this. Do this and loop until cancel, and then we're going. So I talked a little bit about this village, Anjar, in Lebanon, and I was not surprised to find Armenians in Anjar. It's an all-Armenian village. They are from a place called Musaler, and Musaler is one of the few. Calling it a happy story in the genocide is really kind of a stretch, but it's one of the few places where Armenians resisted the genocide. They went up on a mountain that luckily had water, and they were able to hold off the Turks for 53 days. And then they were rescued by a French warship, and everyone lived. So it's a great story. There's actually a German Jew named Franz Wervel wrote a book about it. It apparently inspired the Warsaw Uprising. He wrote it in the 30s in Germany as a kind of an attempt to be like, hey guys, bad stuff is happening. And so they're all from this village, Musaler, and they speak the Musalerci dialect. They keep the same traditions as the old country. If my great-grandparents went to a wedding, they'd feel very much at home. They might kind of look askance at some of the dresses that people are wearing, but they'd feel very at home. And the reason that they would feel very at home is that my great-grandmothers are both from Musaler. And so I went there very early in the project, and I was extremely insecure because I'd never done a story that I was connected to before. I am only half Armenian. I speak Armenian very badly. And Anjartis are tough. They kind of look at Beiruti Armenians as like, oh, these assimilated Armenians. They're tough people. And so I was really insecure. And then I met the local priest, and the priest said, oh, Tufankjian, are you related to, actually, George and Mariam Tufankjian? And that is Mariam Tufankjian, who is my great-grandmother. And apparently, in the 60s or 70s, I think the 60s, my great-grandparents had gone back to the old country. They went back to Harput, where my great-grandfather was from, and then they went to Vakifla, which is, near Musaler, where my great-grandmothers are from, and then they went to Syria to visit relatives in Beirut, and they went to Anjar. And so I was kind of welcomed in as a daughter of Musaler, and I went back. The last place I went for this project is I went back to Anjar, and I went for Surp Hach, which is the Holy Cross Day, and it's also the anniversary it was the 99th anniversary of the rescue of the Musalerti people. And so there's a huge celebration, and they cook the traditional harissa, which is the food that people ate to survive on the mountain, which tastes exactly like what you would think food you would eat to survive on a mountain tastes like. And it's this amazing thing. And then they play the dawazorna, which is the traditional musical instrument, and people are dancing. And I have never felt more connected to kind of my family and my heritage than at that moment. And that was the moment where the project was finished. And so it felt really like it felt like a really good finishing point. Yeah. Anyone else have any questions? Yes.
Hey, Scott.
Hi.
So the question I have is, during this process, this time you spent putting this book together and all that, was there a time, a moment, and probably more of a feeling that surprised you? That you sort of learned something that you didn't even know?
Yeah, it's the biggest surprise, I think. I try to, so as a photographer, I try to go into every situation with as few expectations as humanly possible, because I think, this is Anjar, by the way. I think if I go in looking for something, then I'm only seeing the things that I'm looking for, and I miss the things that are maybe actually there that I didn't know were there. So in terms of kind of being surprised by things, I'm surprised by everything. I'm not surprised by anything. It's just all kind of this amazing, unique experience. But I think the biggest surprise for me was how much people, how kind of, when I was a kid, I thought that everyone kind of understood themselves and their Armenianness, and it was all very clear to them, and I was the only one that was kind of not thinking about these things. I obviously didn't think I was the only person thinking about these things, but and to talk to everyone and find that everyone is kind of wrestling with these issues and everyone's kind of got different slants on things was really amazing. In terms of surprising, I mean, you're Armenian, you go to Haiti to cover the earthquake, and the guy running the UN thing is named Kevork. You're like, oh, Akhberjan, hi. Everywhere you go, there are Armenians. The Russian boxers I photographed here, I was with these group of very nice young Armenian guys, and we were going to the church, which is one of the places everyone takes me, is we go to the church first. And I saw these guys with these mallets, these huge dudes, and one of them had a big metal mallet, and he's hitting a tire that has been embedded in the ground. And as a photographer, you're like, yes, this is the most former Soviet Union thing that ever former Soviet Union. It's amazing. Like, they're standing in a parking lot hitting tires with a mallet. This is so great. And so I'm taking pictures of it, and I'm having a really good time. And the guys who are going to take me to the church are saying, Scout, the mass is going to be over soon, which is hilarious because mass is 5 hours long. And one of the guys with the mallet turns to the other guy with the mallet and says, and this will only make sense to Armenian, but he goes, oh, Akhberjan Shadlave, which is in Armenian. He's like, oh, my brother, that's really good. And they were Armenian, and it turned out that it was the Union of Russia. These guys. It turned out it was the Union of Russian Armenian Sporting Club. And at that point, my friends were convinced that I was, in fact, a vampire that was turning everyone Armenian. But yes, you will all go home from this. People who have never heard of Armenians before, you will go home from this and you'll be like, oh my God, you guys are everywhere. Because we are.
I think that was Sarah.
Yep.
Hi.
Hi.
So it's actually really fascinating looking at this and hearing you speak about it because my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. Mm-hmm. My entire family was wiped out, and I always really struggled with how I related to my Jewish identity that didn't just have to do with the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, was there a point where, what was the point where you started to really, you started to see that shift where it stopped just being about this cohort event, this cohort despair that you all sort of have running through you, and started to become about
Well, for me, and I can only speak for myself, so I can't speak for everyone. But I can speak for the people who I interviewed who answered this question, basically. But I don't remember a time when I didn't know about the genocide. I have a lot of people talk about, when I was 7, I found out about this, or Peter Blocking's book, he talks about finding out when I think it was in high school. There's a lot of people who remember knowing about it. I don't remember a time where I didn't know about it. My grandmother called it the massacres. They're from Boston, so the massacres. She didn't call it the genocide because it just wasn't part of her vocabulary at the time. And I don't remember a time when I didn't know about it. And in fact, I do remember I didn't know about genocide denial until I was in middle school. We had to do a kind of historical report about the last 100 years, and so I wrote about the genocide, and my teacher told me I was making it up. And it wasn't until then that I knew that genocide denial was a thing. And I don't know if it's my family or but I never grew up thinking of relating my Armenianness to the genocide, or certainly not solely to the genocide. I mean, it was certainly a formative part of our history and was why we were in America, but it wasn't, being Armenian to me was about kind of being loud and being a hustler, and stories about my grandfather and his animals and my great-grandfather and his, stories from the old country. It was much more stories about life and less stories about, the march into the desert. And so that might be unique to my family because a lot of people don't have that experience. But I will say that I met hundreds and hundreds of Armenians throughout this, and I did not meet a single person who defined their Armenianness solely by the genocide. It's whether it was religion or music or personality or the way they relate to their family or food or, it was not just about the genocide. And there's been kind of a lot of things written recently that say that, Armenians do just see themselves through the viewpoint of the genocide. And I did not find that to be true at all. I mean, it's possible that I managed to miss all those people. But I think that it's more the outside world that sees us. I mean, because if you look at the Jewish community, people know the Holocaust happened, but no one sees like New York Jews just through the eyes of the Holocaust. It's much more about culture and... Yeah, I mean, it's everything from Woody Allen to food to I mean, it's a kind of large cultural, yeah, exactly, much more of a tapestry, and I think it's the outside world, and we're a tiny minority. There just aren't that many of us, and so I'm not blaming anyone for just seeing Armenians as the genocide, but we don't see ourselves that way. So we think we're the most important people in the world. We invented wine and shoes, which is actually true, sort of. They found the oldest wine and the oldest shoe in Armenia, therefore we invented them. Also water and air. Yeah. And Christianity.
Anybody else?
Share.
Share.
I'm thinking about it.
Oh, you should.
I kind of... I don't know.
Sorry,
I know. I probably should. Should be like, see, there's all those Armenians. There was no genocide.
I think that's it. I think good?
Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks.